Greetings. In this video, we're going to explore GEDmatch Oracle with the emphasis on Oracle, right? In other words, this video is going to explore the practice of trying to infer one's ancestry from Oracle. So that's not merely from the results found in a particular GEDmatch project calculator, but rather from Oracle, which is like a second step beyond one's initial GEDmatch results. And I'll explain as we go through this video. Now, there are already a number of resources available online on this topic, on the subject of Oracle, a couple of which I intend to show in this video. So this video will more narrowly explore the topic within the context of Teotw Ministries' concept of Autosomal Israelites. For those of you who don't know, while many within the diverse Israelite spectrum hold to a patrilineal definition of Israelite, Teotw Ministries, which used to claim to affirm a patrilineal definition, has since moved away from that. And in place of a patrilineal definition of Israel, they have embraced this idea of autosomal Israelites. And they have argued that whether or not a person is an autosomal Israelite can be demonstrated via recourse to GEDmatch Oracle. So that's another part of what we're going to explore in this video. Now, admittedly, their precise argument here has been somewhat unclear, to put it mildly, and it's also evolved over time. So in this video, we're also going to chart a bit of the evolution of Teotw's rules for autosomal Israelites. In short, we're going to explore what sort of findings in Oracle demonstrate that one is an autosomal Israelite according to Teotw Ministries. And then we're going to explore how reasonable we should consider those rules. So to begin, I'd like to play a couple of clips from last November when one of the Teotw twins, specifically Teotw, appeared on Berean TV to discuss their particular model on DNA, their genetic model. And again, this is from November of 2021. The first clip will be a little over 2 minutes, and it captures my own interaction with Teotw. And then the second clip, which will play immediately after the first, the second clip will be a little less than 2 minutes, capturing an interaction that happened later that evening between the Orthodox Moor and Teotw. Now, as you listen to these clips, note in particular that at that time, the Teotw twins were arguing that getting a hit for Ethiopian Jew in GEDmatch Oracle, in a GEDmatch Oracle calculator, would serve as proof that one descended paternally from Jacob, right? And, at that point, Teotw was informed first by me and later by Moor that I also was able to get hits for Ethiopian Jew in GEDmatch Oracle, a point which will also come up later in this video. But whatever the case, just listen out for that. Listen to his claim that, Ethiopian Jewish hit in Oracle establishes that one is an Israelite. And back then, since they were holding to a paternal definition of Israelite back then, or at least claiming to do so, he even claims that you can establish your paternal ancestry by getting a hit for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle. But here, listen to the two clips. This will run for about 4 minutes.
So when you start talking about long time scales, autosomal DNA does not reveal your paternal line.
Sure it does, because we have proof in our GEDmatch results. We have evidence that shows we're tied to the Ethiopians, but it's in the distant past. It even shows that we're tied to the Sephardic Jews in the distant past. So it does match. It's just that the percentage of the match decreases over time.
No.
Right? No, look, what you mean? No, look. You can go, hold on. Let's get your DNA, Berean. Let's run it through GEDmatch and let's see what the results are. You're going to line up with Ethiopian Jews, Sephardic Jews, and what's the other one? There's a couple of more. We all do. Every last one of us,
including me. I also got an Ethiopian Jewish.
But I'm not saying. I mean, do you? Okay, then maybe you do have some tie to the Israelites. That's my point.
There's another problem here. When you're saying GEDmatch, you mean specifically GEDmatch Oracle, where you use a GEDmatch calculator and then beyond that you click the Oracle results, correct?
Correct. So because it breaks down your historical line.
It says that it doesn't necessarily show descent. Oracle is not necessarily showing descent. It's just showing similarities that you might have. Your genetic makeup might have some similarity with the population.
Okay.
And so, for example,
no.
like I don't have
Hold on.
let me tell you that, like, for example, when I use the GEDmatch calculators, I don't get Italian, right? I'm not Italian. None of my DNA results came up Italian, right? I don't have any Italian ancestry, right? So when I'm using GEDmatch, I don't get Italian. But when I start going into Oracle, I do start getting Italian. Now, why? The way it does, the distance, when it talks about distance, that's talking about probability. It's talking about distances and similarities, not distances in terms of chronology. The reason why on certain calculators in Oracle I get Italian is because part of my DNA is North African and part of it is European. And unsurprisingly, they probably have Italian samples that are likewise partially North African and partially European. And so that's why I get Italian in Oracle, not because I descend from Italian.
Look, your very state.
And I'd like to use Abu as an example, right? Because Abu was talking about Abu came on my show and showed his DNA, etc., whatnot, and he ran his DNA through GEDmatch and through the Ethio helix at that, right? Which is the one that a lot of the urban apologists were telling Israelites they need to run their DNA through. And Abu came up higher in connected in Ethio helix and came up higher with Ethiopian Jew than almost everyone else that I've seen in the Israelite community, right? But Abu, yes, 100%. You can go check this out on my channel. I compared it to mine as well. I have me and Abu and I believe Teotw and Yakoba also said that they actually show up as Ethio helix or Ethiopian Jew and Ethio helix. Not very many people in the Israelite community do. We show up, most of us show up as Ethiopian Jew, like the MGLP, etc. But in Ethio helix, Abu showed up very, very high. And so he shows up higher than I get, like, again, more than 99% of the people I check out who's DNA who's in the Israelite community, right?
Hold on a minute. Tell your Ministries extended. It's I put it in the comment section. I put it in there 2 times. Go ahead, Moor.
So in the example that you played earlier with that 97% European with the E haplogroup, they were saying it's problematic that he's European. You can't say that he's African or that he has the E haplogroup, et cetera, right? Or that he connects to the E, he connects more to the European. Like, so in Abu's situation, he connects more to the Ethiopian DNA than almost all of us do in terms of the autosomal concept through GEDmatch, right? Yet he's phenotypically not East African, right? And he's genetically, and hold on, he's genetically mostly not East African. He's like mostly North African, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
I would expect that from Abu. I mean, we don't teach phenotype being the key.
Okay, so having seen that, let's add to our list of Teotw's rules for Autosomal Israelites, right? It seems pretty clear that at that time, again, back in November of 2021, Teotw Ministries was affirming this rule. If you get Ethiopian Jew in Oracle, then you're an Israelite. And at that time, a few different people around them were arguing along those lines, saying, things like, look, I got Ethiopian Jew in my DNA results, so that proves that I'm an Israelite. And as was touched on by DNA results, they mean GEDmatch Oracle results, not merely with GEDmatch, but GEDmatch Oracle. And again, I want to emphasize Oracle. This is going to be made a bit more clear as we move on in this video. However, less than a week after that discussion on Berean TV, Moor and Yakoba, which is the other Teotw twin, Moor and Yakoba had this exchange on Facebook, right? Moor was jokingly calling me, quote, he was calling me a quote, whole autosomal Ethiopian Jew, end quote. And then he added the hilarious hashtag RM269 Ethiopian Jew. What Moor was getting at with that bit of satire was that if we took seriously the argument of Teotw Ministries, that if a person gets Ethiopian Jew in Oracle, then they're a patrilineal descendant of Jacob. If we took that seriously, there's a bit of a problem, as you have guys like me who have a subclade of RM269 as their paternal haplogroup, yet who also get hits for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle, right? And this creates a problem as the methodology is awkward if it results in people with E haplogroups and people with R haplogroups and a couple of guys with G haplogroups all getting designated as patrilineal descendants of Jacob, right? They can't all descend patrilineally from Jacob. So clearly the Teotw twins methodology back then was producing false positives. Now, in reply to Moor's playful comment, Yakoba, and I don't think he meant this playfully, Yakoba declared me to be Esau. He was saying, I'm not an Israelite, rather I'm an Edomite. Now, as just to be clear, I don't claim to be a descendant of Jacob, so I'm totally fine with people saying I'm not an Israelite. But Moore then asked him how one goes about determining that via their autosomal approach and their appeals to GEDmatch Oracle, right? Moore even noted that as per the Oracle results, which have been made publicly available, I seem closer to being an Ethiopian Jew than our friend Pastor Kelly, who was likewise treating Oracle as evidence, of alleged Israelite ancestry. Unfortunately, Yakoba did not answer Moore's question about their methodology, and how they go about distinguishing Edomites from Israelites, for example. But he did introduce this helpful rule, quote, just because you have some Ethiopian Jews lineage, that does not make you Israel, end quote. So says Yakoba, among the Teotw twins of Teotw Ministries. Now, as a disclaimer, just to be clear, for the sake of clarity, I want to note that I did not claim to have Ethiopian Jewish lineage. Rather, I and Moore were both noting that I got hits for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle. And I'll explain this distinction a bit later in the video. But for now, just note that Yakoba's new rule was nonetheless helpful, as it pretty much meant that even if you get Ethiopian Jew in Oracle, that doesn't actually mean you're an Israelite. So let's add that to our list of Teotw's rules for Autosomal Israelites. Do you remember that first rule where if you get a hit for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle, then you're an Israelite? Well, we're going to have to strike that rule from the list. The Teotw twins have apparently abandoned that rule. The new rule is this: getting a hit for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle does not mean you're an Israelite. I personally think that's a helpful rule. Now, with that, let's move on. You might have noticed in Yakoba's comment that there was a point about the aforementioned Pastor Kelly also getting Lemba in his Oracle results. And the significance of, a Lemba hit came up again a few months later in the comment section of this YouTube community post. In that comment section, there was some discussion about being autosomally Israelite. And one gentleman who was a bit skeptical commented as follows, quote, "There is no such thing as Israelite autosomal DNA," end quote. Teotw Ministries responded to that with the acronym ROFL, which stands for Rolling on the Floor Laughing. So, they're already mocking this gentleman. And then Teotw Ministries declared that, yes, there is, right? There is such a thing as Israelite autosomal DNA. So the relevant gentleman asked them what Israelite autosomal makeup would look like. Teotw Ministries responded by recommending a video on Sista E's channel, and then noted that many have gotten Lemba. Then they took a shot at the Genesis 49ers account, speculating that perhaps they have different autosomal results. That's interesting. Whatever the case, that exchange allows us to add another rule to our list of Teotw's rules for autosomal Israelites. This new rule is as follows: if you get Lemba in Oracle, then you're an Israelite. Now, there doesn't seem to be much justification for this rule, right? I mean, as has been covered in some of my other videos, including my video on Lemba DNA, the excitement about the Lemba, because there are certain mainstream Jews who are excited about the Lemba and see them as descendants of Jacob. The excitement is not about their autosomal makeup. It's about the patrilineal makeup. It's about the Y DNA of some Lemba, not all Lemba. But whatever the case, putting that aside, at least we're getting a clear notion of Teotw Ministries' methodology, right? Then again, perhaps not, as roughly a week later, Teotw Ministries put up this YouTube community post in which they declare a guy associated with the Genesis 49ers account and the Yap Gang to possibly be Esau, which is to say not an Israelite, but rather an Edomite. And by the way, notice how this post also accuses Genesis 49ers and the Yap Gang of fearing discussion on autosomal DNA. That's a bit ironic since the Teotw twins are typing that from behind a block wall. They blocked all those guys in the Yap Gang to avoid dialogue with them. But this will come up again, towards the end of the video. But for now, I want to point out that in that community post in which they were mocking a particular member of the Yap Gang, a particular associate of Genesis 49ers, in that YouTube community post, Teotw Ministries shared some of the DNA results which were received by the man they were mocking. In their post, they highlighted the European results, but they seem to have overlooked the fact that the man also has a result for Lemba. Now, the man was using My True Ancestry, but the system that's employed by that company overlaps with the system that's employed by Oracle. So you can be confident that if the man in question got Lemba here, he can get Lemba in GEDmatch Oracle as well, right? And yet the Teotw twins have declared him to likely be an Edomite, as if to say that autosomally, he's not an Israelite. Well, with that in mind, let's bring down our board, which has the list of Teotw's rules for Autosomal Israelites. You remember that rule that if you get Lemba in Oracle, then you're an Israelite? Well, it seems we need to strike that rule as well and introduce this new rule. Getting Lemba in Oracle does not mean you're an Israelite. We base this new rule on the premise that, according to Teotw Ministries, there's an Edomite in the Yap gang who can still get Lemba in his Oracle results. Oh, and by the way, after seeing Teotw Ministries' post, I reached out to the relevant gentleman, and he confirmed to me that he's also gotten hits for Ethiopian Jew in Oracle. And yet, Teotw Ministries has declared him to likely be an Edomite. So with that in mind, let's erase the board and put this rule on there. Getting both Ethiopian Jew and Lemba in Oracle does not prove you're an Israelite. Why do I say this? Because according to Teotw Ministries, there's an Edomite in the Yap gang. And that particular quote-unquote Edomite has apparently gotten both Lemba hits and Ethiopian Jewish hits in Oracle, right? Now, if that is the rule, then let's be clear, let's be honest, the Teotw twins have pretty much undermined and dismantled the very argument from his side, which was so celebrated. You know, there were a number of people around them, the Teotw twins and a number of their supporters were pushing this idea of, we proved we're Israelites through, these DNA results, and then they point to GEDmatch Oracle results. But it seems now that argument has been undermined by the Teotw twins themselves. But I would say that I personally agree with this rule, which you see on your screen. And to explain why, let's actually get into a basic fact about GEDmatch Oracle. So this is the classic interface for GEDmatch.com, and you can see the URL at the top of the screen, right? Classic.GEDmatch.com. GEDmatch has its own wikis, right? It has its own sort of Wikipedia, and I want to show you how to access GEDmatch's own wiki on their admixture calculators, which discusses Oracle as well. Unfortunately, I cannot link directly to the relevant wiki entry, and that's because the link apparently won't work if you're not logged in. But if you are logged in, this is what you do. You simply scroll on their main page, scroll down to their information section, and click the link marked GEDmatch Wiki. And once you're there, you can either enter admixture into the search or scroll down to the link marked as admixture, excuse me. you just scroll down to that link marked admixture, and which is for ethnicity calculators. And when you click that, this is the GEDmatch wiki entry for their admixture tool. And you then scroll down to the interesting section on Oracle. It states that Oracle calculates how your genome compares to other populations and mixtures, and GEDmatch's own wiki states the following, quote, "This doesn't mean the results will actually show your ethnic group or those of your parents in dual mode or grandparents in four-way mode," end quote. In other words, while it's possible that you descend from a population listed in your Oracle results, the mere presence of that population in your Oracle results does not prove that you actually descend from that population. In short, Oracle results are not necessarily proof of ancestry. And here's a helpful entry from the data mining DNA account, which is also relevant here. The entry is on GEDmatch Oracle, and at one point, the following is stated, quote, "It's important to understand that Oracle isn't measuring shared DNA between your kit and the reference samples. It's calculating how closely the breakdown of your ethnicity percentages match the breakdown of a reference population across the same categories," end quote. To make this more clear, to sort of illustrate what's being said, let's look at some Oracle results that different people got, right? And since both Moor and Yakoba brought up our friend Pastor Kelly, let's consider the Oracle results, which he was kind enough to share publicly.
So I want to share this real quick about my DNA results, right? This is one of them, but I got others that I keep personal because I have more of my personal information there. So for the sake of my, for security, I don't put it out there.
Okay, so some things, as he said, there's certain things he keeps private, but this is what he was willing to share publicly, right? Now, note that Lemba appears, and also note that Ethiopian Jew appears. Also note those numbers beside each hit. Now, this was also, briefly discussed in my exchange with Teotw on Berean TV last November, which was shown earlier in this video. Those numbers are the distance figures. Now, Teotw Ministries seem to wrongly think that they refer to distances in time, but in reality, they are distances in similarity. They show how similar your admixture composition is to a population which is listed in your results. I would propose that they should be interpreted as probability figures. In other words, the higher your distance for a particular hit, the less probable it is that you actually descend from that population. And conversely, the lower your distance, right, the more probable it is that you actually have some sort of meaningful connection to that population. And now that raises the question, so what should be considered a figure that's too high and what should be considered a figure that's reasonable, right? Let's get into that. So I want to ask that we all pay attention to these distance figures, as in a little while I'm going to show a chart comparing different figures, but I'll also ask that, that as we go along, you yourself, the viewer, make mental notes along the way. So for example, with Dr. Kelly, you'll notice that the distance figure for his Lemba hit is 10.85, right? Slightly under 11. And the distance for his Ethiopian Jewish hit is 64.86, slightly under 65, right? And here are some Oracle results, which the Teotw twins publicly shared. This is from when they appeared on Sista E's channel in September of 2019 in a show titled Let's Talk with Sista E, DNA Conversation with Teotw. And of course, I'll share links to all my sources in the video description. Now note that Yakoba got a distance of slightly over 22 for Lemba, which his brother got, while his brother got a distance of slightly under 22 for Lemba, they're twin brothers, so it makes sense that they're so close. And so too, for their Ethiopian Jewish hits, they both got a distance of around 53. And I'm going with the lowest distance of what has been shown, right? So with that said, I'd like to now return to the main page of the GEDmatch website, and we're going to scroll down to the link for their admixture tool. Once there, you can choose your project, right? And for this one, I'm going to begin with EthioHelix. Now, once you're in that project, you have to choose your particular calculator. On this first run, I'm going to go through several calculators, but on this first run, I'm choosing the K10 plus Japanese calculator, as I think it's helpful insofar that it will separate out my East Asian DNA, right? Some calculators will lump everything together, but, my East Asian DNA will get put under Japanese, right? And then, you enter in your kit number, and I hope you don't mind if I censor that. I must confess, I found it a bit concerning that Kelly and the Teotw twins had some unknown reason for not being, completely forthcoming with their own information and their own kit number. Whatever the case, here are my results in the EthioHelix K10 plus Japanese calculator. Now, these are GEDmatch results. When people talk about Oracle, they're talking about these buttons here, which say Oracle. Now, I would caution everyone to be skeptical about a population you don't get in your results in GEDmatch proper, but which you do get in your Oracle results. So I'll go ahead and click the button for Oracle to pull up my single population comparisons. And as you look these results over, note my hit for Ethiopian Jew and note the distance. Here, the distance is slightly under 48. Now, admittedly, I got other distances, higher distances with other calculators, but I figured everyone else is putting forth, they're putting their best foot forward. So I'll focus on this particular result in a bit later in the video, right? I figure everybody's showing their lowest distance, right? And I'd actually say that a distance of 48 is extraordinarily high, and thus should be taken to mean profoundly improbable. But I'll touch on that also a bit later in this video. But with that, let's check Oracle in another calculator. So I'm returning to the page where we choose our project, and I'm sticking with EthioHelix. And as far as which calculator I'm choosing, this time I'm choosing the K10 plus Palestinian calculator. I'll put in my kit number, and mainly I'm showing this calculator because I just love that EthioHelix has a Palestinian calculator, right? I couldn't pass up, the opportunity to show that in this video.
أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني والله أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني.
Sorry about that. I love that song, and I doubt I'll have a better opportunity to slip it into a video somewhere than this one. It seemed like about as auspicious a time as any. But putting that aside, trying to get serious again, I'll click that Oracle button again. And this time I want to show my mixed mode results. Now, look in particular at that 12th line where the possibility of me being 16% Ethiopian Jew is listed with a distance as low as 3. Now, I can assure you that I am not 16% Ethiopian Jewish. In order for that to be the case, I'd have to have a grandparent who was like 64% Ethiopian Jew, which I doubt is something my family would have missed, right? So there's a point to be made here, right? And that again is that Oracle is discussing possibilities and probabilities. You should be skeptical about a result you get only in Oracle and not in GEDmatch proper, right? Like if to find a particular result, you have to go beyond your initial GEDmatch results into Oracle, that should be a cause for concern, right? It should be a cause for skepticism. And as was noted, a result you get in Oracle doesn't necessarily mean you actually have ancestry from that population. Moreover, note that I am not 16% Ethiopian Jewish, but I got a hit for Ethiopian Jewish at a distance of 3. I would propose that if someone is bragging about a hit they got in Oracle at a distance significantly larger than 3, we should see the likelihood of them actually descending from that population being significantly more improbable than the odds of me being 16% Ethiopian Jewish. Food for thought, right? With that, let's choose a different calculator. This time I'm going to choose a different project. So here I'm going to choose Dotycad. And for the precise calculator, I'm going to choose Africa 9. So I'll put in my kit number and then I'll let this load up. So here are my primary results on the Dotycad Africa 9 calculator. And now I'm going to click that Oracle button yet again. And you might notice that I have a Moroccan Jewish hit at a distance of 18. I'd say that's a very large distance, and thus it's very improbable that I'm simply a Moroccan Jew. But still, note that it's more probable than what the Teotw twins showed for Lemba. But that aside, I want to focus on my result for Tuscan, which is a type of Italian. Tuscany is in Italy, right? Toscana, as some say. Now, note that I do not have any actual Italian ancestry, right? So that begs the question, what is going on here? Well, recall that Oracle is comparing your admixture percentages across different, ethnicities or population groups. They're comparing those admixture percentages to those of its samples. Now, I have a small amount of North African DNA and a significantly larger amount of European DNA. Therefore, it makes sense that a few different Oracle calculators would compare me to various Italian samples, as their Italian samples probably likewise have a mildly similar ratio of North African admixture and a larger proportion of European admixture, right? But alas, I do not have any European ancestry. Oh, and by the way, this point about percentages also helps to offer some food for thought on the question of, like if a person doesn't descend from like the Lemba, why would they get Lemba higher than, let's say, they get some West African population, right? Like the Yoruba or the Igbo or something like that, right? Or some other Bantu population. Here's what I would speculatively propose. I would propose that GEDmatch calculators probably have a sort of Bantu standard sample, right? In which like members of the West African diaspora in the Americas, they differ from that, even though they descend from it, they probably differ from that insofar that they've picked up more, different admixture in their time in the Americas, right? And so the reason why they would, in this sense of like percentages, look more like Lemba than a West African population is because the Lemba likewise probably have a large amount in common with like what's considered like a Bantu standard or treated like a Bantu standard amongst the different, Oracle samples. But then they also have stuff that's not part of that standard. And so that's probably where the comparison comes in. Both the Lemba and African Americans sort of have this, large percentage of Bantu DNA, and then, a chunk which is not standard for West African populations. And that those chunks could differ from each other and still, possibly trigger a comparison of sorts. Whatever the case, as I'm going to cover in a bit, the gentleman that we've been looking at least Pastor Kelly, and especially the Teotw twins, they're less likely to be, Lemba than I am to be Italian, right? As I said, I do not have any Italian ancestry, yet I get a type of Italian at a distance of 9. And I could go to my mixed mode population results and show that in this calculator, I get a hit of 73% Moroccan Jewish with a distance under 3. But again, I can assure you that just as I'm not Italian, right, so too I'm not 73% Moroccan, right? While I do have paternal ancestry from Morocco, I am not 73% Moroccan, whether Jewish Moroccan or non-Jewish Moroccan, right? But with that, I want to show this helpful little chart of the results we've been looking at, right? The member of the Yap gang, which Teotw Ministries mocked, has jokingly referred to himself as the Balkan bully. So, just for fun, that's how I'm listing him here in this chart. Now, note these distances, right, for the different hits, right? Again, these differences should be taken as measuring probabilities, right? The lower the distance, the more likely you are to have an actual connection to the population which is listed. And conversely, the higher the distance, the less likely that should be considered. So when looking at the Lemba column, note that the Balkan bully, who was mocked as an Edomite by the Teotw twins, has a distance for Lemba which is half that of what the Teotw twins showed. So he's apparently twice as likely as them to have an actual connection to the Lemba. Isn't that interesting? Now compare my Italian result to the distances in the Lemba column. Now, as I just touched on, I don't actually have any Italian ancestry, but I'm slightly more likely to be Italian than Kelly is to be Lemba. So too, the probability of me actually being Italian is twice as high as the chances of the Teotw twins actually being Lemba, right? Even though I don't have any Italian ancestry. Again, food for thought. So too, that partial Ethiopian Jewish column, that was where my probability of being 16% Ethiopian Jewish was listed as a distance of slightly over 3. You know, even though I'm not actually 16% Ethiopian Jewish, I'm still about 7 times more likely to be that than are the Teotw twins' chances of being Lemba, right? Again, food for thought, right? That should really put these distance figures into perspective, right? Turn your attention to our figures, turn your attention to our figures for Ethiopian Jewish, right? My best distance was less than the distances they showed, right? It was less than Kelly's distance. It was less than the Teotw twins' distance, but it's still, I would say, astronomically high, right? Even my distance, which is in the 40s, I would say you should treat these numbers as meaning that it is highly unlikely that any of us actually descend from Ethiopian Jews, right? It's possible, but it's not terribly likely, right? But stepping away from Oracle, I want to show one more calculator in GEDmatch proper. I'm not going to go into Oracle for this one, just we're going to stick with GEDmatch proper. So for this, I'm going to choose the Gedrosia DNA project. And the calculator I'm going to choose is the Ancient Eurasia K6 calculator. And the reason why I want to do this is because it compares your admixture to ancient Natufian samples. Now, on a certain level, I would caution everyone not to get too excited about the results anyone gets for Natufians. You have to understand that this particular calculator has a limited number of samples, and thus, certain non-Natufian DNA, which is closer to their Natufian samples than to their non-Natufian samples, is going to get listed under Natufian, right? It's the same reason that my Filipino ancestry gets listed under Japanese in the EthioHelix K10 plus Japanese calculator, because my Filipino ancestry is closer to Japanese than it is to their non-Japanese samples, right? So it's a similar case here, right? But nonetheless, this particular calculator, despite what was just mentioned, I'd say this particular calculator is at least helpful comparing autosomal proximities to the Natufians, right? And this is relevant to the Teotw twins' concept of a so-called autosomal Israelite, right? It immediately begs the question, what should we think Jacob, the biblical Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, what should we think he looked like autosomally, right? Might Jacob have been autosomally similar to the Natufians? And if so, might we use the Natufians as a sort of soft placeholder for an autosomal Israelite model? And if we can do that, I'd love to ask, how high were the Teotw twins' Natufian percentages? Were they as high as mine, right? And what about those of Pastor Kelly? Like, what did he get for Natufian, right? Now, however, one might reject this proposal that I just put forth on the grounds that the biblical Jacob lived millennia after the time of the Natufian samples, right? And there may have been significant demographic change in the Levant in that time period. In fact, I'd say there definitely was significant demographic change, right? And that's fine. I think that's a legitimate objection. But that would in turn beg the question, what sort of picture does the extant genetic evidence paint regarding demographic change in the Levant, between the time of the Natufians and the time of Jacob, right? Should we take into account the significant admixture coming in from the Zagros region and let that shape our concept of an autosomal Israelite at the time of the Bronze Age, which is to say the time of the biblical Jacob, right? Think about that. And with that in mind, and also since the Teotw twins jabbed at Genesis 49ers and even accused them of fearing discussion on autosomal DNA, I'd like to play a 2-minute clip from a discussion which Genesis 49ers did on precisely the topic of Teotw Ministries and the autosomal question. And as Yeshub touches on in this clip, the position that there are members of the African diaspora who descend patrilineally from Jacob does not require you to conclude that they have to also be autosomally similar to Jacob, right? You can easily differ autosomally from a particular ancestor who lived more than 3 millennia before you were born, right? I think that's true of a great many of us, right? You can be a patrilineal descendant of someone, who lived thousands of years ago and yet differ from them autosomally. So if Teotw Ministries wants to insist on, an autosomal definition of Israelite, here's some questions to keep in mind, to contemplate while you watch this clip. What is our model for an autosomal Israelite? Like, what are we comparing people's autosomal DNA to, right? And on what grounds do we make that particular thing the standard for an autosomal Israelite? Can we use the Natufians? Do we have to use something else? What should we use? Whatever the case, here's the clip of Yeshub discussing, what Jacob might have looked like autosomally and how similar he might have been to, the West African diaspora today, autosomally. This clip will run about 2 minutes.
You think Jacob's bone is, if we did have Jacob's bone, let's just speak this hypothetical, right? Let's speak to it. If we did have Jacob's bone, you think that he would have 80% sub-Saharan African DNA? Think about that. Where did Jacob live? Who did he interact with? Who did he have sex with? Who did his parents have sex with? This is how you get autosomes, through sex, through reproduction. Did he have sex with the locals of sub-Saharan Africa? Did he marry the Bushmen? Was he interacting with the Khoisan? Was he? Why would he have an autosomal estimate with 80% sub-Saharan African, like some of you African Americans do? Why would he have that if he's not even in the region or around those people that carry those autosomes? If you know anything about E1B1A, if you know anything about that, you can go to ISOGG and verify this. We came from the north down into sub-Saharan Africa. That's when we start admixing with the locals of sub-Saharan Africa and picking up those autosomes. Before then, we didn't even have the same phenotype we have today. I've covered this in prior episodes. Covered this already. So if you've been following us, you've been following the YAP movement, you already know this. We wouldn't be, if you look at the Ibero-Mauritians, they're 66% Near Eastern autosomally. 66% Near Eastern autosomally. And less than a third sub-Saharan African. What's true today is not going to be true 3,000, 4,000 years. So if we did find Jacob's bones, more than likely his autosomal makeup is going to be Near Eastern. It's not going to be sub-Saharan African. Then what? Then what?
Okay, now I'm about to close this video, but before I do, I want to anticipate that some, including possibly the Teotw twins themselves, might wonder why I'm exploring the subject at all, right? They might treat it as an unfair criticism, and they might declare that I should not be involved in this discussion at all, right? Because that's what's happened in the past. So I want to point out that there was actually a challenge for the various people who are, designated as quote unquote UA to get into specifically Teotw's DNA model, right? Look at the text on your screen and listen to Berea reading this declaration that the so-called UA was scared to grapple with Teotw Ministries' arguments on DNA.
I thought the UA was going to bring that DNA smoke. Now they MIA. I shut their whole narrative down. Abu catching Brown and Kelly was amateur hour compared to me. Teotw and Sister E having the whole UA too shook to jump on your show again about the DNA.
So there you have it. There was a challenge for people to look at the Teotw twins' arguments about DNA. There was a declaration that people were scared to look at Teotw twins, the Teotw twins' arguments about DNA. So I would have to say, in light of that challenge, in light of that declaration that people were scared, it was fair for me to delve into this subject, right? And I think I have handled this subject fairly, right? The subject of DNA. For example, an honest assessment of the genetic evidence has worked out phenomenally well for Dante Fortson, for example, right? And you can see my past videos on that subject. Now, it might not be working out as well for certain other people, right? It might not work out as well for them as it did for Dante, but that's not a problem with the DNA. Rather, that's probably a problem with the assumptions those particular people have about themselves, right? Whatever the case, the central point that I'm trying to make here is that it is fair for me to explore Teotw's model, as, you know, people were being challenged to do precisely that. People were even being accused of being scared of the Teotw twins model. And yet, when I actually started exploring their model, the Teotw twins complained bitterly. Months after that challenge, you know, which basically waved off the Pews controversy, you know, and accused people of being scared to switch to the DNA topic. Months after that challenge was put forth, the Teotw twins put up a YouTube community post complaining that I did precisely that. They were complaining that I moved from the topic of the Pews to the topic of DNA. Honestly, that seems a bit unfair, right? Does it not? If there's a challenge, if there's an accusation that people are scared to examine their model, why complain when people actually start examining their model, right? That's a legitimate question. But unfortunately, this is a familiar pattern with the Teotw twins. This also happened with the topic of the Pews as well. You see, back in December 2020, before I had addressed the claims that a Tel Aviv-based Hebrew scholar named Richard Katz had confirmed Hebrew on the Pews, Yakoba wrote this Facebook post, which you see on the screen. He was accusing me of hiding from the topic of the Pews, right? Isn't that obviously a challenge and an invitation for me to return to the topic of the Pews, right? Isn't that them accusing me of running scared from the topic? Well, you know, 2 days later, I dropped my videos on what were then the current topics related to the Pews, which was not only Katz, but so too Kelly's attempt to give a Soletreo reading for a Pew, right? It was just 2 days after this Facebook post that I dropped my, next videos and addressed the subject. I basically took up the challenge and returned to the subject. And a few days later, the Teotw twins put up a YouTube community post in which they actually complained. They complained bitterly that people were still discussing the Pews, right? This was only a week after they had challenged me to return to the subject, and now all of a sudden they're complaining that I did so, right? They suddenly wanted the subject to be dropped. With all due respect, the Teotw twins and their supporters need to stop doing this, right? Whether it's on DNA or the Pews or any other topic, they need to stop with this pattern of accusing people of being scared of a new piece of evidence, only to then get angry when someone takes up their challenges and invitations to explore the topic, right? What exactly is the message that they're trying to send, right? It's almost like they're saying, look at this bit of evidence, but don't look too closely, right? Daring people to explore a topic and then suddenly trying to declare it outrageous to explore the topic when they do so that's a pretty glaring example of moving the goalposts and, changing the rules abruptly.
This one, changing the rules, changing the rules suddenly. No, my friend, no. Don't play these games, this one not nice, my friend.
But, I'll stop here. As always, I look forward to and I welcome the comments of others. God bless.
He a whole white man. He might be brown skinned, but he a whole white man, according to his DNA results that he put up going against this. And them folk got the nerve to blow at them Jews over there. Unbelievable. Science is important. All of y'all don't like that.
But I choose to walk in the spirit is difficult, dealing with all of the ignorance. But in the Bible, still talking about the Bible, what is the benefit? Everything about you counterfeit, there ain't no rebuttal you can counter with. On the internet, you the master teacher, in real life, you powerless. Keep it real with you, I don't have time for this, I ride for this, my forefathers died for this. They cry for this opportunity, presently I possess, and right now you are the opposite. If you walk in love, you fulfill the law, don't get involved and you ain't giving it all. If you ever think it's cool to threaten another man's family, then you already lost. Chemtrails got aluminum, heavy metal saturate the atmosphere. Manhattan Project, time travel, Mandela effect, what happened here? GMO food processing to the whole world become obsolete. A black man who believes in Jesus got my own team taking shots at me. You trespassing on property that you don't fully understand properly. All the back and forth, that's not for me, that's for ROC and the War Machine. If we ride together, then we ride together. If we can't do it, I'd rather leave. I still stand on the word of God till the day I die and no longer breathe. We trapped inside the diaspora, nightmares of the massacre. Cold sweat, I'm below deck in the middle passage, just a passenger. Revolutionary hardcore, liberation, that's a hard job. You ain't ready, you a oddball. Keep your mouth closed like lockjaw. I learned trying to bring people together on the same page, make them separate. All the talk about reconciliation, when the time come, you hesitate. If Jesus was able to sit at the table with a bunch of sinners, you very fake. Your steps ordered by the Lord, and how it was yesterday, your big mistake. We the city sitting on the hill. Guess it all depends on how you live. Guess it all depends on how you feel, and we both know that ain't God's will. I stood on what I felt was right. I don't never question if God's real. Trapped inside this matrix, I'm about to pop the red and the blue pill.
Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one toward another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, said the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:14-21.